So this, the talk that I gave in Madison a couple of years ago was the first part of the book that I actually wrote. And it was about the films of Malaysian filmmaker Yasmin Ahmad. And it came to be chapter 3 in the book. And so I'm going to take you through the other chapters that sort of grew out of that first project. So Yasmin Ahmad is a Malaysian filmmaker. She's a late, she passed a couple of years ago. And she was, I think, to me, came to be a kind of national voice because she didn't just make film. She became known for making these commercials, these public service sort of short videos that were released during Hari Merdeka, that were commissioned by Petronas. So to me, she was this national voice. But I first heard about her when her films appeared at Western film festivals. And I hadn't seen the films, but I heard about the reception. And audiences at these festivals were very taken, very touched by these films. And when I finally saw them, they had these very obvious joys, right? She was as a former commercial producer, I think she was a commercial executive, advertising executive until she died. But she was very skilled because of that in melodramatic form. And as you can see in this still from one of her first films, Sepet, these intertextual references to movies of Wong Kar-wai, Hong Kong soap operas, Thai pop music, and Hollywood as well. But what struck me, more than that, right, was that in this film in particular, she cited very explicitly the work of Frantz Fanon, and she used it extra-textually, right, around the film in her personal political life to take on reactionary portions of Malaysian Islam. And because of this explicit citation of Fanon, I thought it was important to hold her accountable politically because she was so Fanon forward with the film. And the conclusion I reached was that it was a fairly reductive reading of Fanon, which you really can't hold a filmmaker too accountable for. But it was also ultimately for me very kind of reactionary, right? But that really doesn't matter. Most important, I found myself when I watched those films thinking about these really small moments of linguistic interplay that made me laugh in a scene like this dinner scene, for example. And so there is something really post-colonial about these films, even without the gratuitous references to Fanon. And what I wanted to do was, in which I eventually did, was I started to understand what she was doing on her soundtrack with the work of French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. And this became first an essay in Positions, and then chapter 3 in the book. And as that project grew, I came to think about post-colonial theory, writ large. And in my field, it's dominated by Spivak and Baba in particular, especially with regards to textual style, film style, where the terms like hybridity and mimicry, strategic essentialism, are very sort of inescapable. And so I wanted to see if I could move beyond these hegemonic theoretical frameworks in a way. In a way, I wanted to go as long as possible without using those words. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because the political context in which Southeast Asian films sit in are different, right? That Baba and Spivak, right, come from a tradition of anti-colonial movements that are in some ways inapplicable to Southeast Asia. And obviously there's probably someone in the audience who will probably say, well, what about Vietnam? What about Cambodia? With a when you title a book with the word Southeast Asia, right, it's going to open myself up to that kind of criticism. But with the cultures, I think that I focus on, for the most part, I think I can safely say, right, that the level of antipathy, right, is kind of different, muted, and arguably sort of nostalgic. And the reason for that, I think, is, for this crowd, fairly well known, like due to the Cold War, which is a paradigm that sort of birthed the region itself, and post-colonial independence had these, came with strings attached, right? And colonial powers were replaced by authoritarian governments. So in that context, the colonial West means something quite different. In short, right, and just condensing a lot here, the colonial West becomes this place where free speech and civil liberties come from, and where film studies is concerned is where critical avant-garde filmmaking comes from. So this is certainly true in Singapore, right, where a country in which politicians and leaders constantly claim that that they don't have any hangups, right? And you can see this quite clearly in their architecture, that they choose to preserve, in the street and station names and train station names that they choose to use, in the history that's narrativized in school textbooks and curated, for example, in the National Museum. And it was certainly enough, right? It's curious and different enough for us to rethink the post-colonial theory canon. So, for example, in films of what is known as the Singaporean New Wave that were made in the late 90s, early aughts, a lot of these films appropriated the style and the form of the French and Italian New Waves, but they did so, right, with very little kind of desire to problematize or qualify that they were from the European film canon. And so they weren't, critiquing anyone else other than the state, right? And so for me, it was worthwhile to think through post-colonial culture, or these post-colonial cultures, with a different set of theories, at least a different set of theories that weren't sort of usually thought to address the post-colonial condition. And Jean-Luc Nancy is an example of that. The book is organized by nation, by national cinema. It's kind of a useful but limited way to be attentive towards the cultural specificity of each nation and the diversity of the region. So apart from the chapter on Malaysia, which was about Yasmin Ahmad, and about Malaysian soundscapes as they exist on Ahmad soundtracks, the chapters on Singapore addressed its preoccupation with space, and the chapter on Indonesia with the persistence of stability discourse in the Reformasi films post-98. So let's start with Singapore. So in Singapore, land scarcity is a major issue, right, in the people's economic, social, and political life. And so space and space management is a very politicized process. And the whole country, if you've been there, if you haven't been there, you probably at least had a layover in Singapore, right? The country is in a constant state of urban renewal. And when films kind of deal with space, right, it's not surprising that they dwell very frequently on the speed and force of urban development and redevelopment. But they're also very tied to a second major theme, alienation, postmodern or otherwise, alienation from the pace of modern life. And these are both sort of narratives that are innovated by discourse that is centered on the state, right? This authoritarian state has this spectral presence within a lot of the films that came out in the late 90s, early aughts, which is important because it was this revival of film production in Singapore after about, might have been a 30-year dormancy period. And so what these films that kind of exploded, right? It was a little small explosion in film festivals in Europe and Asia, for example. They they examined a lot of the social costs of development, and a lot of them reviewed what was lost, right? What is lost when uh, your homes get razed, when most people went to primary schools that aren't standing anymore, and so on. And so these films are more indirectly about the government's role in people's social and psychological lives. And so as it was with Yasmin Ahmad, I came to see something quite different in these films. And when I got support to go to Singapore to do field work, this happened to be in the aftermath of its 50th anniversary celebrations. And so there were a lot of art exhibitions and history exhibitions still around town, even though it was a year after. And I kind of saw, right, I was able to get this overview of how that country sort of constructs its identity and how it curates its history. And what struck me was that it does so with maps. And the maps were literally everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean in every exhibit. It just seemed to me that anytime an artist would tell the story of the nation, it was a map. It was a map or an atlas, some kind of spatial document, right? And so this is an example of that. It's the most sort of PowerPoint sort of friendly slide I have. And there are others, right? You just trust me that there are others. That every time Singaporeans told a story about themselves, they kind of used maps. And so because of that, once I figured that out, I started to see maps everywhere. And I'll just highlight a very, very visible one that exists and is present in and around a very important emblem of national pride. It's subway system. So this is the logo of the Land Transportation Authority. It's a very symbolic avatar of the pride that the nation feels. It has invested, right, in that first class subway system. It is a logo, it's a symbol that draws people towards it, provides kind of orientations every day, and is a reassuring sign, right? Because if you're in a subway station, there's no way you can get lost. And by design, this logo is an approximation of Singapore's landmass. And in and around the station, you'll see that logo under system maps. And so this aerial shot, right, of Singapore's landmass is this inescapable image, this cartographical, in this instance, this cartographical instrument laid over to me, a potent symbol, right? This is an aerial view of Singapore. And constantly, right, so because they're so ubiquitous, it evokes this local awareness of itself as a node in a regional, colonial, global network. This is an image of a national ego that is summoned when people, when people look around when they need to get their bearings. And so this aerial view was conscripted more than once in Singapore's entry, or Singapore's national pavilion display at the 2015 Venice Biennale, where nations participating in this art exhibition used these pavilions to represent themselves. A year later, I was there when when this exhibit was the cornerstone of a series of talks about port cities, of which Singapore is obviously one. And out of those activities, it became clear that there's this unremitting, right, engagement with post-colonial history and phenomenology, and that there's this post-colonial phenomenology of space that kind of infuses through how people were talking about culture and thinking about themselves. Singaporean films are very readable in that sense, right? As phenomenological artifacts in a very cartographical cinema. And let me unpack that, what I just said. And so the argument, right? The argument of the book, the argument in my chapter about Singapore is that Singapore cinema is cartographical. And there are two parts to that idea. The first is that the films that Singapore tends to make are maps, which is not surprising because, as I said, every time it makes art, it draws a map. But more than that, right? The maps are also making films. So this is what you see. This is a floor-to-ceiling exhibit, which is the first exhibit that you see in the Singapore History Gallery that is in the basement of the National Museum, right? So it's a 30,000 square foot exhibit that kind of tells the story of Singapore's history. I think it was made to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And so this is what you see when you walk in these the big double doors. You see this floor-to-ceiling depiction, animated version of the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius's first edition of Theatrum Orbis Terranum, the theater of the world. And it's a close-up of Southeast Asia. And it's animated because there's this magnifying glass that kind of floats over the region. And it will come to rest at certain points. And when it comes to rest at a certain point, certain facts, right, about what it's looking at will pop up. So as you see in this moment, the magnifying lens is resting over Singapore, and there's this piece of trivia that pops up next to it. So this is what you see when you enter that exhibit. As you walk through the exhibit, more maps, right? Every time something happens, they talk about themselves with a map. And at the end, right, there's another map. And this one is titled "Becoming a Global City," where you walk up to these touch screens and you type in where you're from, and it tells you, right, the relationship that Singapore has with that country that you have just typed in. So in a darkened gallery, right, these exhibits really approximate the experience of cinema. And more than that, right, because of this exhibit and this exhibit, it allowed me to say, right, that Singapore's history starts and ends as cartography and as cartographic cinema, and starts and ends with the work of maps. Here's another example. So I came across the work of this geographer, Rudolf de Koning. And he was trained in Singapore, worked in National University of Singapore for a while. Then he moved back to the Netherlands. And he wrote this book titled Singapore, an Atlas of Perpetual Territorial Transformation. And it's a book that kind of charts how Singapore's geography has changed. And within this book, there was this thesis, right? And what de Koning argued was that the rapid development and the rapid urban development and redevelopment was in fact doing ideological work, that it led to very strong spatial instability that then positioned the state, right, as a psychological bulwark, right, as this constant source of stability, right? And so it's sort of lent itself to a kind of dependence onto state authority. Now, de Koning never really elaborated, right, on that thesis, so there's no way to really think about it much other than to recognize that it's kind of interesting. He doesn't do much to prove it. What was most interesting to me was how the book is structured. So the evidence for his argument is with a series of triptychs, right, of maps, a couple of decades apart, and that illustrate with these aerial maps how Singapore's infrastructure changes and evolves. To me, this was another sort of iteration of how Singapore's history is cartographic, and how its cartography is in fact cinematic, because one of the things I guess do now in my study of data is I'm kind of familiar with the work of what is known as media archaeology, where media epistemologies start to materialize in other forms. And so the thing about these triptychs is that they look like film strips, right? Similarities with variations between that animate sort of movement. And so it's possible for me to say, right, that history is cartographic in Singapore and that cartography is cinematic. And more than that, that its cinema is cartographic. And in other words, in short, the films draw maps. And so like the other arts, which seem to have this preferred discursive palette, films likewise, do the same. For this notion of cartographic cinema, what I do is I borrow heavily from the work of Tom Conley and Teresa Castro, right? Two people who have theorized this notion of cartographic cinema. And they argue that cinema and maps are co-extensive, is their term, in that they both refer to the same world, they have this shared affinity with space, and they're both read the same way. What that means is, that we understand films in the way that we read maps, right? They share the same sort of mode of interaction and engagement. And so subsequently, or consequently, to them, cinema has this mapping impulse. And mapping impulse to them generally appears symptomatically in three cartographic shapes, as panoramas, atlases, and aerial views, all of which are just so evident in Singaporean art. And so these are images that survey in totalities, that catalog places, that offer a sense of scale, and enable the spectator a perspective that traverses space and time. And this is, not just observable in Singaporean art, but thoroughly observable in Singaporean cinema. To me, a filmmaker whose films are particularly cartographic is the documentarian Tan Pin Pin. She has this urge that is thoroughly focused on national character, right? Almost every film she makes, sort of tries to figure out what it means to be, what Singapore is, what it means to be Singaporean. And I wanted to start with the opening minute of probably one of her most famous films, Singapore Gaga.
Wasted days and wasted nights I had left for you behind. For you don't belong to me. Your heart belongs to someone else. Why should I keep loving you? I know that you're not true. Why should I call your name when you're the blame?
Welcome to Singapore, ladies and gentlemen. And to all Singaporeans and residents of Singapore, a warm welcome home.
So the film starts with a series of aerial views and panoramas. We look out the window, it comes back to the flight map. We look back out the window and our eyes come back to the flight map. So Singapore Gaga is a documentary survey of sounds of Singapore, right? And here we just saw the sound of a street busker. The thing about this catalog, right, this atlas of Singapore's soundscape, is that what Tan does is that she provides these locational data, right, often to the side of her frames, you have this logo, this ubiquitous logo of the transportation system that tells us where we are. And over again, we see that symbol. And what it does is it constructs this mental sort of geography in our head, right? It unfurls this map, or unfolds this map in our head. And as the film kind of proceeds, we have these episodes of people who a lot of street buskers, but sounds of radio shows, of even Margaret Langton's performance of 433, and so on. And again, what happens, right, is that what Tan does is she draws a map. And so it's important because she's this fairly crucial sort of voice that is still spending her career sort of making films about what it means to be Singaporean. And so in her films, I see this very pure distillation of this cartographic impulse, this mapping impulse. So Gaga, what it does, Singapore Gaga, what it does is that it constitutes this atlas, right? And these shots of stations, these peripheral views of the logo, it activates in our minds a map of the whole. In the following slide, this is a film that was part of the Venice Biennale National Pavilion, titled All the Lines Flow Out by Gerald Sim. And you see, again, even though it's a film that's about storm canals, it's still about infrastructure in some way or another, right? And these canals, because they run through the entire country, it does the same thing in that it draws maps. Whereas Pin Pin gets us to imagine subway lines, right? These are pathways of another medium. So what I did with the book, right, is I elaborate on a greater diversity of these expressions, and I list sort of examples, as many examples as I could, of films adopting these cartographical shapes. Spoiler alert, it wasn't hard, right? So over and over again, there were these aerial shots that catalog spaces, that mapped island organized around a colonial city, right? The part of the city that's, that sort of centers itself in the waterfront, where the port was. And so there's this predisposition, I found, right, that persisted across production eras. So Singapore's film history is pretty much split into two, right? A golden era, a golden age in the 50s and 60s, where Malay films dominated, and then this revival starting in the late 90s. And you see over and over again, right, you see aerial maps, this aerial tendency in old films and new films. And these stills, right, the reason I didn't need to go hunt, too far for these stills, is that there's this website that someone got a library grant to set up, that I think is still titled Singapore Film Locations, right? So again, over and over again, right? There's this need to document space. There's this need to draw maps. There's a need to document maps with other atlases, right? And so this predilection, this cartographical understanding of space and therefore identity, to me constitutes the mapping impulse in national phenomenology, which is informed by Singapore's history as a colonial port city and its physical status as an island, a diminutive one at that, right? That is one that is almost devoid of natural resources, one that must continue to leverage its status as a gateway between East and West. The thing is, because that aerial shot, right, the aerial perspective is also kind of it's a perspective of Singapore as a node in a network, right, in the region and in the world. Now, when we look at a map, wherever you're from, wherever you are, we instinctively want to find ourselves, right? And this is what this exhibit, tries to satiate. But with Singapore, right, that is an instinct that meets with perpetual futility, because Singapore is just too small. The magnifying glass in this exhibit is both remedy and performance of that, right? So Singapore refers to itself very commonly, self-deprecatingly, as a red dot. There are TV shows that use that name, right? It's a kind of euphemism for itself. And the red dot is important. It's doubly important because it's an allusion to Singapore's small size and the tension, this ambivalence of pride and fear, right? Pride in that, look at what we can do despite our small size. Fear because, well, we're really small with nothing in it, right, other than ourselves. And so this size, right, this small size is a reminder of Singapore's dependency, the fact that it is not self-sufficient. And so these views are inseparable from an imagination, a historical imagination of itself as a port city, a port that was chosen by Britain for its strategic location within a network of shipping lanes with which to challenge Dutch monopoly in the region. Now, Singapore looks at red dots with the same perspective as it does with aerial maps from above. They both illuminate a map of the world, and through these perspectives, Singapore rehearses self-knowledge of its interconnectedness within the world. Now, size and interconnectedness emerge from its experience as an island. Philosopher Jacques Derrida in The Beast and the Sovereign wrote about Robinson Crusoe. But in that sort of explication, Derrida likens the island experience to an autoimmune condition. Within the logic that he discusses, the self is attacked from within through a self-persecutory destruction of one's own defenses. Whereas Derrida appropriates the island allegory to ruminate over the binary of refuge and escape, I use the idea to make sense of these overhead surveys of Singapore's landmass. To me, they're self-reflexive, and they evoke in the same desire a murky concurrence and strange simultaneity when it comes to the insularity of the island, between attraction and repulsion, between insular philia and insular phobia. So in other words, this is the best and worst part of being an island, right? The fact that you're alone. And this is this fear and pride that is part of sea state, right? These exhibits in sea state. And so as much as one likes to be distinct and independent, an island has to live with the fear of isolation, this pre-existing condition, right, as a place for which interconnectedness is so necessary. And so this is something that Charles Lim reenacts with these works. These fears also play out in one of perhaps the most celebrated moment of trauma, also commemorated in the Singapore History Gallery, which was when Singapore was ejected from Malaya. It's the moment of its independence, and to me, it's quite astounding, right? Because it's Singapore's birth. It's when it got its independence, but it's also this moment of great tragedy.
Every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. I mean, for me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life, you see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, as people,
so this is extraordinary because, you know, there aren't that many examples where a country gets independence and it's famous. That moment is famous for its leader sobbing on national television, and symptomatic, right, of what Derrida talks about as this autoimmune condition. So Singapore's image of itself as an island, visualized in aerial maps and bird's eye views as cartographical symbols, is subtended by this cache of historical knowledge and fraught psychic emotion. In another film from the early aughts, titled Perth, this is another sort of revival film that evokes a new wave from another countries, unironically. Perth is this homage to Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, right? It's about this local taxi driver who kind of lives alone, is kind of a loner, yearns to earn enough as a cabbie to go migrate to Perth. And this is the title frame for the film, where there's this long shot of the financial district, of Singapore's financial district. But the titles, Perth, right, push our view outward towards the southeast, right, where Australia is. And it constructs, again, a mental map, right, a view of, a cartographical view of Singapore and of the world. In Perth, the character is his backstory is that he used to be in the merchant marines. And when he tells us this, right, it constructs this in a very affective way, a map of Singapore's colonial identity. Oops.
This is where I started. First mate for 20 years. Now not even a security guard. But I've been around the world, seen it all. Europe, France, South America, South Africa, Cambodia, Vietnam.
So the nostalgia and the pride with which he talks about being in the merchant marines evokes Singapore's history in British shipping and its colonial history. The director, in fact, says that the protagonist here is a post-colonial subject. So in short, Perth, again, right, its cartographical gestures unfurl the colonial map. For Singapore, insularity is not an option, right? The reason why shipping is important and why infrastructure is important. And it is embodied, right? This awareness is embodied by this exhibit that I mentioned before, which comes from the very purposeful decision, right, that Singapore made to leverage its colonial role as a vital port. So I'm going to wrap up Singapore here. So Singapore is hyper aware of its interconnectedness, right? It is, and this interconnectedness is geographically necessitated. perpetuates the strategic role that Singapore served for the crown, and it's ossified within its identity, within its culture and its art. So that spirit, right, that identity, right, sits within Singapore's colonial imagination, cinematically and visually iterated in all the aerial maps that we see. Another way in which Singapore's post-colonial character persists cartographically, right? It's in its cinema. In its cinema is in the atlases that the films very often use to establish that this is Singapore, right? And so I have a couple of examples of this. In that, usually a lot of times when films start and they tell you that this is Singapore, they always start with a shot of the former colonial city by the river before it moves out, right? Before it moves out on infrastructure, on roads towards the outer parts, right? The suburbs, the villages, the rural parts. And so this is another way in which Singapore's cartography is post-colonial. With regards to Indonesia, I know there's no real transition here, but with regards to Indonesia, in looking at Indonesia's post-colonial cinema and its character in cinema, I focused on its colonial relationship to the United States. In the absence of an actual physical occupation, Edward Said describes this relationship as a kind of indirect colonialism. Indonesia's less antagonistic experience with the US works for the book because it falls more in line with its neighbors' view of the British. And the American relationship forged during the Cold War also offered me a more unimpeded view of Indonesia's place within the history of contemporary capitalism. Internally, Cold War exigencies enabled Suharto's militaristic authoritarianism. And the New Order government was birthed, as we all know, in trauma, crisis, and horror. The killings of 65 and 66, first and foremost. Over the years, Suharto sold authoritarianism as a necessary condition of order and exploited fears of communist instability and disorder to legitimate his own power. Now that mindset for Indonesia left a legacy in post-colonial Indonesian cinema, which takes continued sort of comfort in classical narrative closure and resolution, as well as its continued reliance on structures of genre. Now let me elaborate. So Indonesian cinema, right, during the New Order, even before the New Order, developed with Hollywood money, expertise, and market dominance enabled by the State Department. It is also marked by distinct, very, very distinct genres, something that almost every work about Indonesian cinema reinforces. The thing about genres is that they reinforce New Order ideology because its formulaic nature, right, begets predictability, which dovetails with the New Order's premium on social and political stability. At the same time, Hollywood genres Americanized colonial subjects and their memories. There's this moment in Joshua Oppenheimer's The Act of Killing, which I have to assume that everyone in the audience is aware of or has seen, that I'd like to pause on. Oppenheimer presents this film as a making of documentary, as a form of creative ethnography. Cynics and critics have deemed this action is sort of complicit, right, with treachery, right? They fault him for misplacing empathy with the killers, while victims' voices remain underrepresented. But I argue that we can also take the film at face value, and that in this film within a film, it foregrounds the apparatus of cinema. In this shot, Anwar Congo looks back at Oppenheimer's camera with his own camera. And I suggest that it compels us to process Anwar's view of the world. It is a view informed by American genres, war films, westerns, musicals, gangster films, and film noir. Since Suharto's ouster in 1998, the country's transition into democratic civil society has been hampered by its inability to acknowledge and move past repressed traumas. It is common for cultural studies for Indonesia to reckon with that, right? On the search for historical tropes and repressed memory. Two examples that come to mind are Mary Zerbuchan's collection, Beginning to Remember, and Laurie Sears' Situated Testimonies. So psychoanalysis in the Indonesian instance is evidence of a dire need to rescue what decades of authoritarianism and trauma have incapacitated: the subjective power to access, recognize, and represent the past. Reformasi films, made 1998 and after, take up this project. The Indonesian film scholar Dag Ingvason has referred to them as the Indonesian New Wave. I prefer Reformasi films. These films are marked by a drive to use newfound expressive freedoms for the purposes of democratization, openness, and engagement in the post-Suharto period. They revisit history, they explore taboos, they recast norms around gender, sexuality, race, religion, all to remake Indonesian society by working through the traumas and violence of life under the new order. Reformasi films are in varying degrees politically conscious. They're also, to me, what I found is that they tended to be Bildungsroman, trying to facilitate national dialogue. And they run the gamut from ambitious art films, somber festival-oriented work, to star vehicles. And they very often contain characters reckoning with violence. So here in the still from Tiga Hari Untuk Selamanya, the main characters, they drive down this road trip, and they drive past a fairly gruesome car accident, which is a metaphor for 65 and 68. And you have these young people trying to come to grips with the sins of father figures who, in their actions or their absence, are affecting the psychological well-being of young people. Right? So over and over again in Reformasi films, we have a very common plot. But in trying to do so, these films are still, in a way, hampered by stability discourse, because they often lean on structure and identifiable, and they're also identifiable by genre, which makes them invariably obedient to narrative conventions and capitalist realism reminiscent of the new order. So this is an important thread that runs through these films. They cohere around an affinity with the road movie, as it were. This is occasionally expressed through allusion rather than iconographic citation, sometimes more implicit than explicit. So what I mean there, right, is that these films are discursively and symbolically identifiable as having road narratives, perhaps second to the Western, the most American of all genres. And in these films, maladjusted young characters traverse local landscapes, encounter native cultures, undergo self-reflection, and actualize identities. These figures may not necessarily roll over paved asphalt highways, in other words, before distant horizons, as you would expect in a road movie, or they might not even be in cars for that matter, right? But they refract and echo road movie syntax as stories of travel through psychological transitional spaces. So I argue that Americanism persists in these films in its function and psychic conduits and historical indices of coming of age stories through the discursive beats and the rhythms of the road film. And so these are deceptively anodyne films that belie cinematic evocations of the period between 1965 and 1998. And I'll actually pause there because I think conversation is a little more useful, productive, and enjoyable, really. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. We now have time for questions, and you can feel free to raise your hand using the little raise hand function. We already have a question for somebody with their hand raised. You can type a question into the chat box, and you can also just start. Well, I guess I have to unmute you. So yeah, raise your hand, wave to the camera, or or type something into the chat box. Okay, let me see here. So our first question is from Sajira, and go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk, Professor. I want to ask you about the cartographic vision of Singapore, in that, in a lot of time, theorists of modernity as well as globalization put boundaries as well as the ability for a nation to both stop and exclude something from both the national vision and the participation in mobility as a way of exercising both sovereignty and shaping this kind of like national vision. So in your films, do you see any, in these aerial shots or cartographic vision, do you see any parts of Singaporean community, the Singaporean people being deliberately excluded in the film genre, as well as do you see any of these communities being deliberately stopped as a way of exclusion from the national image or something like that?
Oh yeah. Well, mobility is this really important this really important idea, right? Because of, well, in short, late capitalism, right? You have this very mobile, upwardly mobile class of people who travel, who study abroad, and less fortunate people who live in public housing, right? So I'm not the only one, and this is not just in the films, but it's in its literature as well. And so this thing about mobility, right? There's this mobile class of people and a highly immobile class of people, right? Who get associated with concrete structures, right? With the land, right? With very often what is public housing images, which are in turn kind of brutalist, right? But also whitewashed, like literally whitewashed. So it's also this modern architecture, but very often brutalist. And in fact, one of the things I can't believe I managed to include in the book, right, is that a lot in these films, what happens in these films where you have depressed young people, right, who are just thoroughly nihilistic, they commit suicide, right? It's a very common thing that happens in Singaporean films, but they all commit suicide in the same way, right? They commit suicide by jumping, and so sometimes it's serious, right? But there are films where these suicide attempts are played for laughs, right? Where there's this, it appeals to this common knowledge that just people jump all the time, and it's almost a spectator sport, right? In some films, right? And it goes over and over again in all these films. So it seems like if you believe the films that Singaporeans like to kill themselves, and they don't kill themselves in any other way, right? So it's this yearning for mobility, right? Yearning for this aerial vision, right? But then sort of failing at that, right? There's no other way to die, no more perfect way to die other than to sort of hurtle towards this land that is so much a part of your identity, and then becoming one with it, right? Literally becoming a red dot, right? On the red dot, right? And so so yes, I hope that at least kind of answers your question in some way.
Thank you. That was really disturbing, interesting. I had no idea about that motif. We have a question in the chat box from Al McCoy. If Singapore has perfected repression by reaching ultimate level in Foucault's model through auto-repression, has any film begun to critique their state, that is the Singaporean state, or even offer a glimmer of critique as a living realization of the Truman Show?
I don't look. One thing I didn't look at, right, are ironically the genre film. So Singapore makes these kind of lowbrow comedies that I didn't really look at because they're almost too popular, and they make these occasional horror films and even less occasional science fiction films. So there might be a film in there that's kind of like that, but I don't know. But it is very clear, right? The state is this perpetual presence in the form of those public housing structures. So in the late 90s, you have these films that put Singapore on the map, right? They, for the first time, or the second time, they put Singapore on the map in that they showed up in the Cannes Film Festival, or in Berlin, or in Tokyo. And that kind of snowballs because it motivates and inspires filmmakers to make more movies. But then they start to make movies with the same kind of language, right? But they don't do it just because of that, right? They do it because, you know, it means something. So over and over again, you have these films where we have lonely figures, right, walking around suicidal, right, in the public housing structures, right? And public housing structures are almost pure distillations of state power, right? Because it is such a strong part of the state's identity. Is one thing we do for you, right? This is one thing we do so well for you. We house you, we put a roof over your head. But it's also, as when I started off saying that that space is politicized, this is one of the ways in which space is politicized. Because come election time, what happens is there's this repeated threat that emerges, implied or explicit, right? That emerges in one way or another, where the state tells them, vote for us, or we won't fix your elevators. and so again, this is how space is power is exerted through space, how space is politicized. And so even though there might not be like a sort of self-reflexive movie or narrative like the Truman Show, the state is more than the spectral presence, right? It's concrete presence in a lot of these films that are critical. They want to be critical, right? But obviously you can't be overtly critical, right? as you know. And so they do it with landscape, right? With the urban landscape.
That's so interesting, thinking about different ways people have code for objecting to or resisting repression. So it's kind of fascinating. We have a hand raised by Polita. Go ahead. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Professor Sim. Was such a wonderful talk, and I just recently got the book and couldn't wait to read it. But I'm particularly very intrigued by your reference or concept, maybe, of post-colonial phenomenology and the sort of attempt to sort of revise the canonical post-colonial text. So I guess like what I'm wondering here is if you could share with us a little further on how that terminology that you used in the book kind of expand over or underlines in each chapter, which is defined by the nation state, right? Because I think it's such an interesting way that to approach that sort of elusiveness of identities, right? Like phenomenology in that sense. So I guess I would really love to hear more on that. And then maybe the second question that comes to my mind after this whole idea around, after listening to this post-colonial phenomenologies and the elusiveness of identities, or at least like how one visualize Singaporean identities in the way you talk about it, is I'm really curious about your thoughts on what sort of what is the contribution of post-colonial studies right now in order for us to think about what is Southeast Asian cinema per se, right? Like, I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned the fact that, well, what about Vietnam? What about Cambodia? What about Thailand, right? So I would really appreciate if you could share with us some of your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Sure. The reason why I said at one point, right, that I wanted to write the book and go as long as possible without citing Baba and Spivak, is because the relationship, Singapore's relationship to the British is different from India's relationship to the British, right? So using Baba and Spivak for these films is entirely possible. You know, there are other people who do so, and those readings are interpretations are useful and really interesting. There's, you know, something missing, right? And what I wanted to do was, all right, because, you know, I started the book with a kind of a tour of Singapore and less so of Malaysia, right? Of how it's curious and how there's this, like, if you don't know the place, it seems so odd, right? That they're so nostalgic, and there's such a fragrant memory, right, of life under the British. And you know, when you look at sculpture and plaques and these odes to the Queen, it's just quite amazing. And what I did not want to, the conclusion I did not want to reach, right, was that this is, I didn't want to condescend. I didn't want to conclude that, oh, you're all just collaborators, right? You're all just, this is just acquiescence or, you know, surrender, you know. So it has to be another reading of that, right? There's, you know, you don't have to be like a serf, right? If you internalize coloniality in that way. And so that's the nuance that's sort of an underlying intention, you know, that I had when I wrote the book, right? That this was different and not necessarily, what's the word? It's kind of losing me right now. But I hope you know what I mean, right? There has to be this third way to understand what is happening in Indonesia. In Singapore and Malaysia, and to a certain extent in Indonesia with the States. But I forgot your second question. Forgive me.
Right. I mean, that was wonderful. I mean, the way you talk about how each nation in Southeast Asia sort of encapsulates and embody the coloniality in different ways. So I guess the second question comes out of that. I guess now I feel like scholars have really tried to think about what is Southeast Asian cinema, right? Or that's like just an overarching term. So I guess my question is more like, do you see your book more like what really redefined or contribute to that question of what is Southeast Asian cinema, or doing something else, if that makes sense to you?
I'll add to what I said before by saying that, you know, in my field at least, you know, if you ask the question, you know, what is post-colonial style, right? If you look at almost any film analysis or piece of film scholarship about post-colonial style, what is post-colonial about this text? The inexorable reference was to hybridity, right? It's always about, this is hybridity, this is mimicry, but it didn't really apply. And what is singularly unique about Southeast Asian post-colonialism, right, is that it is not hostile, right? Obviously there's hostility, obviously, right? But if you look at Singapore, if you look at Malaysia, if you look at Thailand, Philippines, right, more than most, right? It's just thoroughly different, shall we say, right? But I structured the book in that they're different in different ways. They're different according to what is most important to that country or their local circumstances. So for Singapore, it's space. For Malaysia, I took it to be sound, and a lot of it rests on the work of what I consider to be the doyen of Malaysian history, Barbara Andaya, right? When she worked her work on sound in Malay culture. And that was the method I adopted.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, because I think it really helps us configure that adoption of post-colonial theory, right, in our studies, and then really lean more toward things that are, like you said, quote unquote, like national concern, right, at a particular point. So I really appreciate your answer. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have a kind of a comment by Kurt. A Land Imagined and I Dream of Singapore are two good recent films that feature unseen places and populations in Singapore. And he says some of my own subjects appear in the latter.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I haven't seen like these films that Kurt cites, but you know, I started noticing these contemporary films made in the last 3, 4, 5 years that kind of look outward, right? That want to be about Singapore, but look at the periphery and look at the margins instead of at some kind of essential core. And you know, I don't know if you've seen a film like A Yellow Bird by Rajagopal. Even some of these festival hits like Ilo Ilo and The Apprentice and Wet Season, right? They're almost evacuating Singapore of any kind of core identity, rather, you know, choosing rather to be about the periphery, right? Choosing to, you know, rather to be about the people who exist on the margins, and using that as a way to kind of understand what Singapore is about, which to me makes sense because of Singapore's history as this gateway, right, as this hub, right, likes to use the word hub, right? You go to any Singaporean website, right, the word hub just, you know, it's inevitable. And so it's not this place you go to, right? It's this place you pass through on your way to where you need to get to. And that's a trope that is more or less kind of present, right, in so many of these films. But I have not seen those films. I will look out for them.
I think we should all have movie night tonight. We have another question from Sarnt. Have you thought of Brunei cinema? Speaking of thinking about the whole region. And he says, which I have no idea about, in comparison to Singapore's geographical plus historical inferiority complex. I'm sorry if I misgendered.
I have not. I know next to nothing about Brunei cinema, I just have to say.
I would be fascinated. Wow. Yeah, you know, somebody should do a talk on Brunei cinema. I think we need that for our collection, for our series. We have time for, I think, 1 or 2 more questions, if anybody has any. I have one. If nobody else has one first, we'll just see. Okay, so I'm interested in the road movies, the kind of road trip movies, which is such a omnipresent genre in America. But I'm interested in in Indonesia, you know, you were emphasizing the New Order imagines an order for Indonesia, and that's actually been influenced by Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew's imagined ordering. And one thing that's interesting about road movies, is you mentioned the word narrative, is they do have narrative. They have a story, and the story has to come to a conclusion that's not just we got there, we arrived, but some tension was resolved, something was resolved. And in Indonesia, at least, you're talking about these narratives that are about issues that are never perhaps going to be resolved. I mean, the 65, 66 massacre, it's interesting to me that there are these films attempting to use this genre in such a treacherous realm, where even coming to any kind of conclusion or resolution, I think, would be a little risky, if not just challenging.
Well, I mean, the point was that these films were trying to be different, right? Because they're trying to reconceive what films were supposed to be. So they were art films. They were, almost experimental films, but not quite. But clearly, films that wanted to be different, that didn't want to be sort of generic products. But the thing is that it was despite that, right? Despite that imperative, that desire, that they still kind of reverted, right, to this need. And of course you can say, well, if you want to make any money, like you need a story that, ties up loose ends. You need a story that makes sense to people. at the same time, right, these are films that, as art films, have this basic understanding that, you know, we're not like a martial arts film, right? We're not an action film, right? We're not The Raid. You know, we're something else, right? We're introspective, we're slow, we're avant-garde, and despite that, right? The point is, despite that, they still kind of went back, right? Relapsed. I use that word with hesitation. To this need for closure, this need for, right? This need for stability. And so you know, it's a kind of a fine point, and it's the most, by far the most speculative chapter of the book. And there's just a lot of qualifications, right? For those of you who are, you know, who might be thinking of making your way through that chapter, right? It's got a ton of qualifications, but you know, that's the point, right? That's what I wanted to, the point I wanted to make.
Fascinating. Well, if we have no more questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Sim for giving wonderful presentations today. And thank you all for coming. We had really interesting questions. I really appreciate all the questions people put out, provocative and food for thought. So thank you for coming today.